Good morning, students. Today, I want to go over part 6 of our book, Music and Appreciation by Roger Camion. This is the 12th edition that we're going over. We are in part 6, the Romantic period, and I would like to start with the first couple of chapters, including the introduction to the Romantic period for this lecture. So to give you a timeline of what's going on during this time period, the Romantic era goes from about 1820 until about 1900, leads us right up to the 20th century. And just a few things that are going on during this time. As you can see here, the Monroe Doctrine, written in 1823, The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, The Three Musketeers, Edgar Allan Poe writing The Raven and his other famous poems, Darwin's The Origin of Species during this time, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, and then in the world, we have the American Civil War going on during this time period, and Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone in 1876. And that's going to have a bigger impact on the 20th century than it does on the Romantic era, but it is an important, notable event that happens during this time. So just to talk about Romanticism in general, as I said, this period is from 1820 to 1900. We usually just refer to this as the 19th century, even though we count the first quarter of the 19th century or so as part of the classical era. This is a time period that stressed emotion, imagination, and individualism. People are thinking more about their emotions and diving more deeply into their imagination, writing fantasy, writing music about fantasy tales, painting depictions of fantasy and horror. And we're really trying to express emotion during this time, even more so than we did in the Baroque era. Again, this is a response to the classical era. The classical era was very straight ahead. You had very basic forms. You didn't have elaborate titles for your pieces. It was just symphony number 95 or whatever. It wasn't anything trying to tell a story. In the Romantic era, we're trying to tell a story. We're talking about emotions and diving into the individuality of the composer and of the writer and of the artists at this time. So a lot of subjectivity as the basis of arts. My worldview is what I'm trying to express as an artist in the Romantic era, whether it's visual arts or poetry or prose or music. Some of the favorite topics of this time, fantasy and the supernatural, as I mentioned. There's some really great horror and gothic arts that come out during this time. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is written during this time. There's a wonderful painting that depicts kind of a nightmarish scene where somebody is sleeping and they're surrounded by these giant bat-like creatures. So really great fantasy and supernatural writing here. And along with that fantasy idea, we have a new fascination with the Middle Ages during this time, going back and looking at it as a time of chivalry and romance. All of these stories that are these fantasy stories like the Lord of the Rings that are based in the Middle Ages are looking back at that time. Of course, Lord of the Rings is written later, but the chivalry and romantic idea, these knights in shining armor and all of this great Middle Ages idea, they tend to ignore things like the plight of the poor during that time and, of course, the plagues and the horrible lifestyle that most people were living during that time, and see it as more of kind of a fantastical worldview there. Nature becomes a mirror of the human heart during this time. We see a lot of artists depicting these landscape scenes, these beautiful scenes of the ocean or of mountains. If you think of the Bob Ross style of painting, that's very much in the style of the Romantic era. And we have an interest in exoticism of the past, looking back at the past and, as I mentioned with the Middle Ages, trying to make it look a lot better than it actually was. The good old days, or looking at it through the rose-colored glasses, as we hear today, we always tend to think of it as the past as a little more glorified than it actually was. And that was certainly true in the Romantic period. This is a time of the Industrial Revolution. We have a lot of social and economic changes happening during this time, and there are a lot of artistic depictions of that. We also see a lot of poetry and prose that focuses on what's going on in the middle class and in the lower class. We have Les Miserables, which is written during this time by Victor Hugo, which is very much depicts the plight of the poor immediately following the French Revolution. In music, we have a ton of romantic composers. In the classical era, we talked about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven as the three main composers. You can see here that in the Romantic era, we get a lot more composers: Schubert, Dvorak, Schumann, Tchaikovsky, Chopin, Brahms, Liszt, Verdi, Mendelssohn, Puccini, Berlioz, Wagner, Mahler, Smetana, just to name a few of them. There's a whole bunch of composers, and we're only really going to go over a few of them. The book even has more than we're actually going to go over in the interest of time here. So there's a lot of composers, and as I said, they all have their individual ideas. So really generalizing the Romantic era is kind of pointless. There's a few overall ideas that we're going to look at in this lecture, but for the most part, I want to take a look at each composer as an individual and listen to their music and look at their style and how they contributed. We do have a continued use of classical forms during this time period: the sonata, the string quartet, the symphony. But we do see, as we saw with Beethoven at the end of the classical era, we see an expansion of those classical forms. The symphonies become much longer. The sonatas become bigger and more grandiose. We see composers using a greater range of tone color and dynamics and pitch than we had in the classical period, using more instruments, expanding our harmony into more complex chords, toying around with dissonances that don't always resolve. In the classical era, it was all about balance, and if you had dissonance, you had to have consonants to go along with it. In the Romantic era, it's okay to play with the emotions a little bit more, so we can have very dissonant chords that don't resolve. Sometimes they just hang on to that dissonance, or they hang on to it for a very long time before they resolve. And it's making people uncomfortable is a common part of Romantic music. So here we get into chapter 2 of part 6, which is a very long chapter talking about the overall characteristics of Romantic music. So as I mentioned before, we have an individuality, that's a hard word to say, an individuality of style. Composers want to be uniquely identified by their music. Berlioz writes to his father that he wants to leave some kind of impact on the world. Schumann writes about Chopin that within 30 seconds of a piece beginning, you'll be able to say that is a Chopin piece. And that's a goal of the Romantic composers, is to be recognized by their individual style and to do something new and different. They don't want to just write the way that Mozart wrote or Haydn wrote. They want to create their own unique styles. And that's why we look at so many different composers of the Romantic era, because they are all individuals and they do all have their each unique style there. There's a lot of expression in the subjects of our Romantic era pieces. All approaches are explored. We're looking at, sometimes we have pieces that are landscapes that are talking about a river flowing through Bohemia. Sometimes we have a march to the scaffold, as we'll hear in Symphonie Fantastique. But we're really exploring all different types of expression during this time period. Romantic love is still a focus of our songs and our operas. We love a good romance story, and we hear a lot of that in these art songs that we'll get to in the next section, and in the operas that we'll look at towards the end of part 6. As I mentioned, we also have these darker topics drawing in composers. Composers like Berlioz writing these fantastical pieces that depict scenes of drug abuse and of hallucinations, and also of horror throughout their music. We have composers like Wagner, who are using Norse mythology to write operas that are very much action sequences, basically superhero stories, where we have a lot of death and a lot of emotion coming through these operas. Nationalism and exoticism become a big part of Romantic society during this time. Nationalism means that it is a music with a national identity. We have a modern day example of this is when you hear bluegrass music, we tend to automatically think of that as a real American music, or Western music of the early 20th century in America, these the gold rush and all of these crazy themes that we hear in Western movies, that very much identifies with the American culture. In the Romantic era, we had a lot of nationalism around Europe and around Asia and Russia during this time. We have composers like Chopin writing very French music, Tchaikovsky using a lot of the themes of Russia during this time, Dvorak writing music of the Czech or the Bohemian people during this time. And you can hear that in the music. And we'll look at these nationalistic composers a little bit later on. We also have an exoticism, intentionally implying a foreign culture during this time. We have operas that are set in Japan and try to evoke that Asian culture. We have Rimsky-Korsakov, who is a Russian composer who writes a piece called Scheherazade that has a very Arabian flair to it. So they're really exoticizing other cultures during this time. We even have Dvorak, who is a Czech composer, come over to the United States and write a symphony called From the New World that's all about the American ideals and American style. Program music becomes a thing during this time where it's not just a symphony. We're going to title it something that evokes some kind of story. The greatest example of this is Symphonie Fantastique, which we'll look at a little bit later on, which tells a story. And there are program notes that go along with this so we can actually hear the story that Berlioz was trying to get across. It's a very fantastical story. And that was very common during this time period. We have Chopin writing his nocturnes that are supposed to evoke a scene of peace and calm at night. We have pieces that are based on actual poetry, like Schubert's The Erlkönig, which we're going to listen to in a little bit for the next lecture, that is a story by Goethe, and it has a great fantastical story behind it. And we have lyrics in that one which really help us to tell the story, but even composers that are writing purely instrumental music are trying to get some kind of story and something interesting across. And they use the expressive tone color that we see here to do that. Trying to create unique sounds, blending existing instruments together and having those existing instruments use unique techniques. We have Berlioz in Symphonie Fantastique tries to get the sound of walking across a field of bones by taking the violin bows and turning them upside down and kind of chattering them on the strings. And it creates this, when you have 50 violins, violas, and cellos all doing that together, it creates this really creepy scene for us. We also have the addition of new instruments. The orchestra of the Romantic era expands to close to 100 instruments for most Romantic composers, and even in the late Romantic, it goes even beyond that. Whereas the orchestras of the classical era, had anywhere between 25 and maybe 50 instruments. So some of the instruments that are added, Beethoven, towards his last couple of pieces, called for trombones, called for tubas, and Romantic composers really take that and run with it. We have a piece by Mahler, the Second Symphony, that calls for 25 brass instruments all at once, which is a whole new, we think about the classical orchestra usually only had a couple of trumpets and a couple of horns, so 4 brass instruments. In the Romantic era, we're expanding that up to 25 brass instruments. We have the addition of the contrabassoon and the bass clarinet and the English horn in the woodwind section. So really exploring these new tone colors. And part of that has to do with the improvements of the instruments. The instruments are really greatly improved during this time, so we can have instruments like the bass clarinet that sounds good in a full orchestra because they've improved the intonation, they've improved the key system on them. And we also can see a greater use of techniques with existing instruments because of those improvements. So composers are allowed to have the opportunity to play around with the tone color there, having the flutes play way down in the lowest register, and it's actually stable and sounds good. and even having our brass players play more melodic content because we've added valves to those instruments. So it's a lot easier to control and hear all of those different notes. We have a lot more colorful harmony coming out in the Romantic era, chords that are built with notes not in traditional keys. I wish I had my piano sitting here and I could just play some of this stuff for you, but we could have, whereas classical music basically follows simple chord progressions like we have in today's music, in the Romantic era, composers start inserting chords from other keys within there. So if you're in the key of C major, you're going to hear mostly C major, F major, G major, E minor, and A minor chords in the music. In the Romantic era, we might start throwing in-between chords in there. So whereas you would hear an A minor chord going to a D minor chord, you would instead throw in an A major chord. Or we might be in the key of C major, but we're going to use an F minor chord as opposed to an F major chord for an interesting effect. Brahms was a composer that was a big fan of using that minor 4 chord in the music. So we hear these kind of borrowed chords all over the place. We hear the harmonic instability used a lot. The tension and the dissonance that's caused from that kind of harmonic instability is something that romantic composers exploited big time. We see an expansion of the range of dynamics, pitch, and tempo during this time. In the classical era, you might see a couple of fortissimos or pianissimos in there, but during the Romantic era, we're going to get all the way up to 4 Fs and 4 Ps, fortissimo and pianissimo, to really express what we're trying to get across during that time period. We have an expanded range. I mentioned the flute players playing at the very low part of their range. We also have, violins going up to the very top of their range. Trumpet players having to really scream out notes to get across certain emotions and certain ideas. Again, the more extreme you are with your music, the more emotional it's going to sound. We also have these changes in moods that are underlined by shifts in tempo. So we have composers that are writing frequent shifts and sometimes very subtle shifts, going from 86 beats a minute to 82 beats per minute. So just slightly holding it back. And we have a technique, and this is a term that's on the exam. Oops, did not mean to click ahead there. A term that's on the exam called rubato, which means a slight holding back or pressing forward of the tempo in music. Whenever you play a piece of music rubato, you're not necessarily focusing on a strict metronomic tempo. You're allowed to play with that to get the emotion across. You get to a certain phrase and you want to hold it back before you resolve so that you can build that tension and add that little bit of emotion to it. We have a huge expansion of forms during this time, a huge range of forms that are used by composers. We have these short piano pieces by Chopin, that are just 2 or 3 minute long piano pieces that do a great job of getting across the emotion in a short period of time, and are also accessible to people who have pianos at their house to be able to play and want to have these shorter pieces to learn. But we also have composers like Mahler who write, who write symphonies and operas that go on for hours and hours, and Wagner who writes a 2.5 hour long opera, and expects people to listen to it, and they do, and it becomes very popular during this time. So the audience of the Romantic era was very willing to accept all types of different compositions during this time. Composers, as I mentioned, are writing symphonies and sonatas and string quartets, concertos, operas, and many other classically traditional works during this time period, but oftentimes they are expanding those. And we do have a few new forms that come around. We're going to talk about the art song in the next lecture, and we'll talk about some of Chopin's ideas like the nocturne and different etudes that come around as new forms. But the old forms were still there as well. Okay, moving on to chapter 3 here, talking about composers and their public. As we talk about most of the time we've talked about with the classical era and the Romantic era, how are composers making a living? How are musicians making a living? The big thing to know about the Romantic era is it follows the idea of Beethoven from the classical era. So we see the demise of the patronage system, and there's a few reasons for that. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed have a huge impact on the court system, and the wealthy just can't afford to constantly be paying for new performances. We don't have these court systems anymore like we had in the Baroque and the Classical era, where we can pay composers to write all the time for our courts. We're focusing on fighting wars and defending our borders. We also see some of the courts being just kind of abolished by the state and moving into larger countries that don't have all of these little individual courtships. They're moving into more of a traditional city and state system like we see today. As I said, Beethoven's freelance style is modeled by a lot of musicians that directly ties into the romantic idea of, I want to be an individual, I want to do what I want, instead of being tied to a patron who is forcing me to write what they want to hear. I'm a freelance musician. I'm going to write the music that I want and hope that somebody buys it later on. And it worked for a lot of composers. The composers are really seen as free spirits during this time. We do have these new, the urban class, the lower and lower middle classes that are being depicted in music during this time. The arts tended to ignore everything below the upper classes up until the Romantic period, but we do start to see a fascination with that and the way that the people on the other side of the tracks are living, and we have compositions that are kind of showing the plight of the average person and the way that the poor are living during this time and have lived in the past. We also see an increased interest in virtuosity. The public absolutely loves this. They want their rock stars. And in the Romantic period, we have some of the first great rock stars come around. People like Franz Liszt, who is a great pianist that would just wow audiences with his virtuosity. The violinist Paganini is another one that becomes hugely popular at this time. And these are, the modern day comparisons of people like Eddie Van Halen and, Tosin Abasi, who are these great performers that we love watching just to watch the spectacle of how good they are. And that really comes around in the Romantic era. And we're going to look at some of these composers and the way they were writing music to show off their virtuosity. The piano becomes a fixture in most homes, like we saw with the lute in the Renaissance era. The piano becomes so commonly built. The Industrial Revolution helps with that it's easy to build, and people just have them in their houses. Much like many of you guys have a guitar in your house, whether you can play it or not. People just have them, and the piano becomes a normal part of that during the Romantic era. And many people were learning how to play the piano. And we do have a vast variety of what pianos are like during this time. We talked about the classical piano being very small, being primarily made of wood, and having a different sound because the hammers didn't have felt on them yet. In the Romantic era, we see things change. We get the steel frame of the piano, which allows us to put more tension on the strings. We also start covering those hammers with felt that makes the piano much more expressive. You can play much softer, and you can still get expressive loud passages as well. We also have an expansion of the range of the piano during the Romantic period. And we have a lot of composers that focus on that. Our first few composers that we're going to look at in the next lecture primarily focused on writing piano music and vocal music, which was primarily for home entertainment, people that would have parties and they wanted to be able to entertain their guests. So they would play these piano pieces or these art songs, which is another reason why many of them were short. You're not sitting in a concert hall where you're expected to listen to an hour-long symphony. We're at home in a parlor, so you're going to want to listen to a 3 or 4 minute piece performed by your host or by a guest. We have a lot of orchestras and opera groups formed during this time. A lot of public orchestras. The New York Philharmonic is founded during the Romantic era, the Vienna Philharmonic during this time, and many others that you can read about in the book. Famous opera companies in and around Europe are formed during this time. And we have some of the first subscription concerts become common in major cities. And what that means is, many of you researched going to the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra concerts during this semester as part of your performance assessments. And you may have noticed that you can actually buy season tickets to the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra just like you can to a sporting event. That came around in the Romantic era where the orchestra would promise to do a concert every couple of weeks, and you could buy tickets to be able to go see all of them. Before the Romantic era, they basically only performed a concert if they had a reason to. They would be kind of randomly scheduled throughout the year, and you would buy individual tickets as opposed to buying a subscription to that concert, to that orchestra, to be able to go and listen to everything that they're doing. The composers in the audience for the first time were in the same social class during the Romantic era. Many composers were, just working class people, and their audience were the same people. So the audience loved that. They loved hearing music that was from people just like them, instead of from these high court composers or church composers that they saw as kind of unattainable. The audience during the Romantic era felt like composers were more relatable to them, and they were more likely to enjoy the music because of that. We also see that very few composers in the Romantic era are financially successful. You don't have the high-class composers like we had in the Baroque era and the Classical era. And again, a lot of that has to do with the individuality. Composers wanted to write music that they wanted to write. They weren't willing to stick with what the publishers wanted or what certain orchestra masters wanted. They wanted to write their own music, and because of that, it became harder to sell it. Most composers during this time period made money by doing other things. They were conductors. Many of the composers in this time were orchestra conductors or music critics. Or even taught lessons. And then, of course, we had those virtuosic performers like Liszt who made their money traveling around and performing their music live, and they weren't really making the money off the compositions themselves. But we do have, because of that, I think we end up with some really great music coming out of the Romantic era because it's coming from the heart. It's not music that is formulaic and, trying to meet a specific need, trying to sell the music. It's music that is emotional and, what the composers really want to write, not what somebody else wants them to write. Okay, we're going to get into the art song in the next section of the lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. That's kind of your introduction to the Romantic period. As I mentioned, it's kind of hard to generalize the Romantic period because so many individual composers have their own ideas and unique ways of doing things. And we'll start looking at those individually starting with the next section. Thanks very much.